Good evening. I'm Laura for Stand Up Minnesota, and this is our series of Facebook Live town halls with the candidates for DFL nomination for Governor of Minnesota. Today we are joined by Paul Thissen, member of the Minnesota House of Representatives for District 61B in Southwest Minneapolis. With family roots in Minnesota dating back to the 1860s, Paul returned to Minnesota after earning his law degree in Chicago. He has been a representative since 2003, serving as minority leader for the DFL and Speaker of the House. For the next hour, Paul will be taking your questions. Just type your question into the feed. We will get to as many as we can. Please welcome Paul Thissen. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And thanks for doing this.
All right. So our first question is from Mary. Mary asks, she'd like to know what your position on public financing of sports stadiums and tax breaks for owners.
Yeah, good question. So I have in the past supported and not supported different proposals for stadiums. You know, I do think that there is a benefit to our community to having professional sports here, and the kind of the way it promotes the Twin Cities in particular, but the state of Minnesota, the way that it kind of binds people together as Minnesotans, which is something we're sorely lacking these days, unfortunately, in many ways. And so I have supported that in the past. And tax breaks, I'm not sure about. I guess for building stadiums, we have provided tax breaks as well. So I think that the stadiums and the professional sports teams add a lot to our communities. The key is that we have to strike the best deal we possibly can, and we do that sometimes, and we don't. I think with the soccer stadium that is being built in St. Paul, where the kind of really the only break that we gave was to make sure that the building materials were not subject to sales tax, which is a common thing we do for many, many projects. That one I think is going to be good, particularly because of the diversity that that sport in particular has drawn to it, and the growing diversity of our community here in Minnesota. So I think that was a wise move for us.
Great. All right, our next question is from Beth Ann, and Beth Ann wants to know, what process will you use to make appointments as governor?
Yeah, well, that's a really important question. And, so I guess the thing that I would say is, we want to have as many people at the table and as much input as possible as we make appointments, and particularly the people who are going to be affected by the decisions, that those commissioners are going to be making. So if it is the Department of Human Services, having people at the table who not only are doctors and nurses, but also people receiving Medicaid and who need to access those services, so that the decision we're making represents the broad breadth of Minnesota. And the other thing that I guess I would say to this question, and it's a larger, I think, an important discussion we're having right now, is, I come to this race, I've come to my job as a state representative and more in recent years, and I come to the job of Minnesota governor from the perspective of knowing that, I've grown up with a certain set of experiences. I was born, fortunate enough to be born in a family that had, some resources. My folks were both public school teachers. I live my life in a situation where I don't feel unsafe as I travel around the state, as I travel around the Twin Cities. I don't, my kids, I'm not worried that they're going to have a decent start on life. And knowing that I come from that place of some privilege, I think it's really important for me to make sure that I acknowledge that, first of all, and understand we need to bring voices that don't always feel that way to the table as we make decisions, including decisions about the kind of appointments we need to make. So it's very important that we have as open and transparent a process as possible. One of the things I've been really working hard for in the legislature is to open up our legislative process to make sure that more voices are heard, but also that people know what's going on. And I think that is as much true about the appointment process.
Great. Charles Russell wants to know, with the closure of the Sudan mine, leaving Fermilab, our only Northwoods quantum science lab, how do you plan to promote physics in the Arrowhead region?
Okay, there's a question that I've not gotten before, so thank you, Charles. I guess one of the things that I have proposed for the last couple of years, and I think it's an important discussion for us to have, is what I call the IDEA Act. And what that is about is putting up a very significant, we proposed $500 million private match, public match in a private-public partnership to really promote research and development in the state of Minnesota. And some of that would go into our K-12 and our post-secondary schools to make sure that people, young students, had the opportunity to be exposed to the types of careers that you can have in research, in technology, in engineering, in manufacturing, those types of things. It would also, though, create a fund that would provide the investment, the infrastructure investment that could happen to put research laboratories all across the state of Minnesota, so that there would be the opportunity for people in the Arrowhead, in western Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, in their communities or near their communities, to a place where you can go to have lab space if you want to do the kind of research and development that would kind of bring the next generation of technology forward. I think that Minnesota really can get on the map if we make the kind of public investment, that we need to make in that kind of infrastructure and training people, and in making sure that people can, entrepreneurs can take this basic research that we're developing here in the state of Minnesota and turn it into real businesses, small businesses in every part of the state. But I guess to your question, the critical part of this IDEA Act is it would create a fund that would establish 4 or 5 labs across the state of Minnesota that would do this kind of research and allow people that are interested in moving forward with that to have access to that, and not just limit that to the Twin Cities. The other thing that I think is really critically important and is an important piece of this is that we really have undervalued the University of Minnesota for the last several years here in the state. It is an important education institution, and it's important that we allow and have access, affordable access, to students from across the state to get a great education at all of our University of Minnesota campuses. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the places that are really succeeding in this new economy, San Francisco's, the Boston's, the Triangle in North Carolina, they all have multiple research universities. And if we don't value that and make the investment we need to have in the state of Minnesota's treasure, the University of Minnesota, not just as a place of education, but also as a place of really, really important basic research, we are going to fall farther and farther behind. And so one of the commitments I want to make, and another piece of this IDEA Act, is to make sure we're making that kind of investment in the University of Minnesota.
Lucy Marie asks, why should women vote for you and not a female candidate? How will you win the women's vote?
Well, again, a really good question. And I think, to me, the real answer is to look at my record. One of the things that in recent years that I've championed, when I was Speaker of the House that I championed, was a bill called the Women's Economic Security Act. And what that act was about was really trying to create a workplace that is more fair for women. And it's a situation where that's not the case right now. And as things have been happening in recent months, recent weeks, we're finding out more and more. But it can't, we need to focus on those sexual harassment issues, which is, terribly wrong. But we also, I think, need to change the power structure within workplaces all across the state of Minnesota. And so what the Women's Economic Security Act did was, first of all, it required for the first time in our state's history that private companies are under law required to do equal pay for equal work equal work. And when they submit to be a contractor for the state of Minnesota, they actually have to submit information that proves that the case, that they're making progress and that they're paying women equal pay for the equal work. And I think that's a really important advance. The second thing, it expanded leave to the time you can take off, not just to have a child, if that's the case, and this is for both men and women, but it impacts women, for better or for worse more, but also to take care of a parent or a spouse who is sick. I think that's an important advance. It also changed some of the rules that we have for discrimination and where the Human Rights Department can intervene for women that are pregnant. In the past, in every other state in the country, you have to prove that your pregnancy is a disability before you can actually get accommodation. The law that we changed, and it's nation leading as part of the Women's Economic Security Act, basically said that if you need an accommodation because you're pregnant, you get that without having to go to the doctor and get a note that says that you're disabled. I think these are really important advances to change the workplace for women, and it's something that I've championed, and I think we need to continue to champion. The other thing I guess I would say is that I'm the author of what we call the Working Parents Act, and that's about sick and safe time, and that's about making sure we have paid family leave, 12 weeks of paid family leave, and then we crack down on wage theft. I mean, the reality is that all of these things like minimum wage, all of these issues impact women, and particularly women of color, much more than they impact the general population. So, these are issues that we have to get after. It's something that I've championed in the past, and I would just encourage folks to look at my record. in terms of these issues. And I'd love to earn your vote. There's not much I can do about my gender, I suppose, but I would love to earn your vote, and I think I have been and will continue to be a great champion for women and for all Minnesotans.
Candy asks, do you support a Medicare for all type of health care, and if not, what do you support? I
do support Medicare for all single payer system. I think it is, to me, this is kind of fundamental Minnesota values. I know that fortunately right now I'm healthy, but I know that there's folks that are sick today and need my help, need me to pay a little bit more so that they can get the care that they need. And I do that, in part because it's the right thing to do, but I also know that in the future when I get sick, there's going to be people there that are going to be willing to take care of me and pay a little bit more to make sure that I get the care that I need. And I think if we start with that basic value proposition, we come to a very different vision of what our healthcare system would be, and that is a system where we're all in one big pool and we're all in it together and we share the risk together. And that just makes common sense to me. I also think it's really important, though, that we don't just stop the discussion with how we're paying for healthcare. It really comes down to how we're going to deliver healthcare. And it can't just be about treating disease. It's got to be about keeping people healthy. And not just doctors and nurses dealing with these issues, but a broad spectrum of people, mental health experts and folks that, deal with housing, and making sure that we're having all the supports there that people can live a healthy life. We know that, disease is about 15%. Doctors can treat about 15% of our health costs. The other part is genetics, some of it. But the biggest part are these social determinants of health, where we live, the way we take care of ourselves. A big investment in public health, which we've done actually a tremendous job here in Minnesota. And I've been proud to be a part of our effort to expand public health efforts in the state. We need to continue to do that and keep people healthy. And the last thing is, we're an amazing place for research, as we talked about a little bit before, and particularly in the area of healthcare. And we should make it a moon mission in our state. And I would, as governor, want to lead this effort to cure diabetes, to solve Alzheimer's, because if we can do those things, and I think we have the capacity right here in Minnesota to do it, not only would it be great for economy and for jobs and for the innovation economy, but it would also save us an amazing amount of money. And it would so improve the quality of life for so many people across the state. So I think it's all of those things that we have to look at. But bottom line is I do support a Medicare for all. It's just the common sense place where we ought to end up in Minnesota.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ellie asks, what will you do to address the racial disparity in Minnesota?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ellie, for asking this question because, frankly, this is one of the biggest motivations for my campaign. Really, the two reasons I ran was, first of all, to deal with the economic insecurity that all Minnesotans are feeling and restore some peace of mind to kind of middle class, lower income, small businesses. If we can do that, we can make a big difference. But this is the other big reason. It's an abomination that we are the second most unequal state in the nation. And Minnesotans, we feel great pride in our state, but this is something that should really put a check on that pride about where Minnesota is today. So I think that there's lots of things that we can do around that, from public safety to education to healthcare. But the biggest, and hopefully we'll get to some of those in a little bit, but the biggest thing I think that we can do is actually start to be intentional about it. The fact of the matter is we do have institutional racism embedded in institutions in our state. And we need to call that out and be very aggressive about changing that. But a lot of these things, a lot of the public policies that tend to even widen the gap are often unintentional consequences of good intentions. So what I have proposed in the legislature and what I will do as the next governor is what I call an equity note or a disparities note. So when we pass a law in the state today, we measure how much it's going to cost and we get an analysis of how much it's going to cost. What the equity note would do and what we could do, what I would do as governor with every bill that comes across my desk is to say, we also should look at, is this going to expand or is this going to shrink the racial gap, the racial disparities that we see in the state of Minnesota? And we have the data and the information that can back that up, but we don't look at it often enough. So I think the very most important thing to deal with this, and there's lots of specifics again, as I've said, is to actually be intentional about it and make an effort. And I think the greatest legacy for this state over the next decade, frankly, would be if we can move from the second most unequal state in the country to being the most equal state in the country. Because if we do that, we're going to raise a lot of people of color and indigenous people. but it's also, if we adopt those policies, it's going to raise everybody up, especially the people that really need to be raised up, the people that are struggling in our economy today. So thank you for asking this question. It is probably, the most important issue, frankly, facing the state. I mean, we have climate change as an existential issue that affects the globe and the country, and certainly Minnesota as well. But this issue is an existential issue for the state of Minnesota, and if we don't solve it, we're going to be in a world of trouble, and it's going to be really kind of the lens through which I pretty much view every decision I make as governor.
Thank you. Jen asks, what are the key economic drivers you see for Minnesota in the next 5 years?
So I guess, to me, and I kind of talked about this a little bit in the previous question, I mean, as I look at the economy, the biggest issue or the biggest measure for me, we need to have growth, and we need to attract to Minnesota as many smart, talented, energetic people as possible. And we need to make sure the folks that are born and growing up here do as well as they possibly can. But for me, the economic question that we really need to grapple with over the next 5, 10, 15 years is this issue of economic security for families and the folks that are really struggling. So we can grow business, and we need to do that, but we need to do it in a way that makes sure that people who are doing the work of actually growing Minnesota are getting a fair shake. So to me, what that comes down to, I mean, healthcare, obviously, and we talked a little bit about that, something we need to solve. So people don't have to go to sleep worrying whether they can see a doctor or nurse in the morning. But it's also about childcare and making sure that people have access to childcare so they can get a job. Transportation is a critical issue, and more that people can actually have reliable transportation to get to work. Retirement security, an affordable college education. I'll tell. I met with a woman this past Sunday in Minneapolis, and she was, 18 or 19-year-old woman, worked at Taco Bell, had a 1.5-year-old child. And she's working hard. She works 40 hours a week. But the way we have the system set up today, because she's working 40 hours a week at a minimum wage job or a little bit above minimum wage, she is really struggling to find care for her child, quality care for her child that she can trust to be able to get to work and to continue working. And she has a car that is unreliable, so it's very difficult sometimes for her to get to her job so that she can earn her living. Those to me, has to be the focus of our economic discussion over the next 5 years. Because, frankly, corporations and the wealthiest Minnesotans, they're doing really, really well right now. The stock market is doing really, really well right now. But there's just too many people in this state who aren't sharing in those benefits. And as the next governor, kind of as I said, in addition to the racial disparities, this issue of economic security is the thing that we really have to get after. Now, the economic drivers, I guess, to come back to that, I'm probably talking too long in this question, so I'm sorry.
You're fine.
But the economic, the other pieces to me for Minnesota's economy, I really do think trying to attract more research and development dollars to the state is really critically important. The strengths that we have in the healthcare industry, which is going to be an incredible growth industry in the world, I think positions Minnesota really well if we can take advantage of that. And I also think that clean water is going to be a huge economic advantage for us, not just in the next 5 years, but in the next 20 years. As we look at what's happening in Arizona, if we look at what's happening in California and the Southwest, our clean water resources are going to be a huge economic advantage for us. Not just the water itself, but we actually are leaders in innovation about how to keep water clean. And so investing in those strengths, I think, is going to be really critical for us. And having a governor that's going to be willing to go out and make the smart decisions, but actually go out and attract that kind of investment, I think is really important too.
Thank you. Mary has a follow-up to her question. She really liked what you said about equity. What do you think about when you think about the environment from an environmental standpoint? For every bill, what is the environmental impact? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea too, and we should absolutely do that. And I have no doubt that we have the information that can do that. And frankly, we should also look at the intersection of those two issues. One of the big issues we know is the case is kind of the injustice around where pollution happens, and the injustice around where pollution happens, and where we put unclean energy sources and all of those things. So that intersection of environment and equity would actually be another great place to kind of measure ourselves. But I love the idea of an environmental note, and I will have to take that back and think through how we can implement that. Thank you for the suggestion.
I have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Not the the question we just asked, but the question before that about economics. In terms of transportation, what sort of infrastructure policies do you support? Gas tax? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, well, so for the large infrastructure, I do support a gas tax, just to kind of be clear about that up front. And we, what it is to me right now is that my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation, they made the investment that allows our economy to be robust right now. And we're falling down as a generation, my generation, in doing that for my kids and the kids after that. And that's the way we need to think about this. And it's not just transportation infrastructure, it's wastewater treatment infrastructure, it's broadband, which we need to get to every part of the state. But on transportation, I do support a gas tax for more roads and bridges, and frankly also there's an environmental piece to that as well in terms of the incentives it creates. But I also think investment in transit is really, really critical, and not just here in the Twin Cities. It's going to look different in Greater Minnesota, but with an aging population, and as I go around and talk to this woman, the woman that works at Taco Bell, I mean, that issue. Transportation is such a stress in her life. And it's not just here in the Twin Cities. I hear over and over again as I go around the state, and particularly again for women, the Office of the Economic Security for Women, which we have at the state, which unfortunately we defunded this last year, but they did an annual survey every year. And the number one issue that came up for women across the state, particularly in Greater Minnesota, was lack of reliable transportation. So it has to be this kind of investment, not just in the infrastructure of roads and bridges, but making sure that people can actually take advantage of that. And maybe one of the things we need to think about is transportation at that level the same way we think about housing, the same way we think about food security, the same way we think about the money that you need to kind of get by. Should transportation fall into that category of entitlements in a sense, where we actually start to support people to have a reliable transportation option so they can get to work, so they can see a doctor or nurse when they need to, so that they can get their kids to school. Anyway, I think all of those things have to come together.
Great, thanks. Rebecca asks, how important is renewable energy to you, and what steps will you take to promote your position on this topic?
Well, I think it's absolutely important, and I think this is actually a place in Minnesota where we can be optimistic and somewhat hopeful because of some of the work that I think we've done at the legislature. So in 2007, I was one of the folks that fought very hard and one of the leaders for getting what we call the RES in place. So a standard that we were going to get a certain percentage of our energy from renewable sources. And we're actually exceeding the goal that we set then because we took a leadership role in doing that, and so the market is actually following. I mean, the cost of wind, the cost of solar are coming down to be competitive with carbon-based fuels. I think that's really exciting for us, and we need to continue doing that. In 2013, when I was a speaker, we passed what was called the solar standard in Minnesota, which really has led to, just in the Star Tribune this weekend, there was a story about how Minnesota is really leading the way in things like solar gardens and solar energy. And part of that bill that I think is really important and that is maybe underappreciated is in that bill we actually put the price of carbon into the cost of energy for the very first time. Very few states, I don't know of any other state that has actually done that. So it was nation leading in that sense. So I think that the work that we've done in the legislature to kind of push the industry, to push people in that direction is really, really important, and we can continue to continue down that path and get to 50-60% renewable energy in a not too distant future. And if we get there, I think we're going to be in really good shape. But the other thing that I think is really important on this issue, and it's a larger issue as well, but energy is a perfect place to talk about it. As I travel particularly around Greater Minnesota, one of the things that I think we need to pay much more attention to is the bleeding of wealth out of our communities and out of our state. And frankly, the wind energy development down in the Buffalo Ridge in southwestern Minnesota, too much of that is owned by companies from out of state. So the wealth that's generated, we get the jobs and we get to put them up and maintain them, but the wealth that's generated from that energy doesn't stay here in Minnesota, isn't reinvested in our communities the way it should be. And I think we need to be much more aggressive about taking advantage of these resources so that they promote Minnesota growth as opposed to, bleeding again out of communities and out of our state.
Emily asks, the fighting between the parties has turned to a level we've never seen before. How do we make sure everyone has a seat at the table? How do we decide who belongs there?
Well, I think on that last question of who belongs there, I mean, the real question to ask is who's going to be affected by the decision that we're making. And those people need to be there. I mean, too often the people that are affected are not at the table. And I think if we start with that question and think, okay, if we have this issue that we need to solve, who are the people that are most impacted and who are the people that have the lived experience that can help us solve it in a way that reflects the reality of their lives. And that's the way that I've tried to do as leader of the Democrats in the House for the last 6 years when I was Speaker of the House, and that's, I think, what I would like to do as governor. When I was Speaker, 90% of the bills passed with bipartisan support. And I think that we did a lot of work to make sure that we got to that place where we were bringing more and more voices in. And we also tried to think very hard about, what is the right thing to do kind of for the values our party believes in, but what is also the right thing to do for Minnesotans in general, and what's the common sense thing to do. And a lot of the things that we achieved when I was Speaker of the House, when we raised the minimum wage, when we passed marriage equality, and when we passed the Women's Economic Security Act, when we invested in all-day kindergarten for the first time in the state, or froze college tuitions, all of those things I think at the end of the day had pretty broad, or eventually got to have pretty broad support across Minnesotans, both Republicans and Democrats, and people who are not affiliated with the party. And if we start from that perspective and solve problems from that perspective, I think that we can make a lot of progress. The other thing that I think is really important in this regard, though, is when decisions are made behind closed doors, first of all, special interests can kind of shape those decisions much more effectively. But when we have this stuff happening behind closed doors, which is happening more and more and more in our legislature, and is very frustrating to me, and which I've fought very hard to change, people don't have to take reasonable positions. When you're debating out in public, you're going to be thinking about what your constituents are thinking about what you're saying, not just what kind of the party bosses or the special interests are thinking. And so the more that we can bring these discussions out into the open, the more that we can make sure that bills are sitting on a legislator's desk so the public and the legislator can review them for at least 24 or 48 hours. To the extent that we can have committee hearings that are open and that are well noticed, so people that are impacted by that decision can actually come down. To the fact that we have to the point that we can have discussions that are not behind closed doors, but very much out in the open. I think that is the most important thing that we can do to kind of undermine this vitriol that we see, this partisan vitriol that's happening. Because again, people have to be actually reasonable when they're appearing in front of their constituents, when they don't necessarily have to be that way when they're behind closed doors. So one of the things that I've said is, if I'm elected the next governor, is that I won't sign a bill, even if I agree with it, if the process that led up to it was not open to the public, was not transparent, and was done behind closed doors. Because not only, I think, does it get to this vitriol between the parties, not only does it get to worse policy outcomes, and I do have one story that kind of encapsulate that, but we also restore trust to the people of Minnesota, trust in their government, trust in democracy. And when we lose that, we kind of lose everything. So I'm a huge proponent of transparency. I've actually put in legislation and want to make sure that the legislature, which exempted itself in the 1970s from what we call the open meeting laws and the Data Practices Act, that we actually apply those rules to ourselves finally. Anyway, so long answer to your question, but I think those are some of the things that we can do.
Do we get to hear your story that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. So last year, I worked with a guy named Senator Ron Latz, and I had legislation around data privacy on the internet. Congress made this decision to kind of roll back privacy provisions. And so near the end of the session, we stepped up with a proposal that said, here in Minnesota, we're going to make sure that the internet companies, Facebook and Google, as well as kind of the internet service providers like Comcast and AT&T, actually get our permission before they use and sell our data, which the Congress again rolled back. And we passed that bill 200 votes to 1 vote in the legislature. It went behind closed doors, and when the bill emerged, kind of one of these huge omnibus bill emerged, that language, which again passed 200 to 1, which is nearly unprecedented, was stripped out of the bill because the special interests got in behind closed doors, and negotiations were done behind closed doors, and the bill arrived on our desks about 7 minutes before we had to vote on it. That's what happens when we don't have the kind of transparency I think we need to bring to the process. When we have transparency, that would not happen.
Thank you. Ellie wants to know, how do you plan to pay for your priorities? Is it going to be taxing businesses and the top income earners, and how will you ensure they stay in Minnesota if that's your plan?
Yeah, so I think that's obviously a really good question. And when I was speaker and Governor Dayton ran, on the idea of taxing the top 2% a little bit more, which we put in place. It was the first general tax increase that the legislature had passed in a generation, really. And what it allowed us to do was balance a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit, pay back the $2+ billion that the state of Minnesota had borrowed from local school districts, build up our budget reserve, but also invest in broadband across the state and all-day kindergarten and freezing college tuitions, and the first investment we made in early childhood education and ensuring a couple 100,000 more Minnesotans. So, I think that we have done that, and I think that that was the right thing to do. And frankly, our economy has done pretty well, even though we raised taxes on the top 2%. And I don't see a lot of those folks fleeing the state of Minnesota. That said, I don't know if that's the place we can go again. We are one of the higher tax states for the highest incomes right now. And, with what they're doing in Washington, D.C., that could exacerbate that problem, quite frankly, the bill that's going to pass this week. But what I would say is the thing that we need to do is roll back the tax cut that was passed last year by the Minnesota legislature, which is about, well over $500 million in this upcoming couple of years, and will expand to well over $1 billion in the upcoming biennium, which is really going to impact our ability to make the investments in education and healthcare and in transportation that we need to make. So I think rolling back much of that tax cut, and remember, $300 million of that tax cut went to tobacco companies. Another big portion of that tax cut went to increase the estate tax, so more very wealthy people's estates are exempted. Rolling back those changes, not because we don't want to provide tax cuts to people, although providing tax cuts to tobacco companies is a very low on my priority list, but it's really a question of, we can cut taxes, that's one option, or we can invest in our schools. And to me, until we actually have schools that are fully funded and we have people that have access to healthcare in a meaningful way, and we have a transportation that actually works for all people and keeps us safe and efficient, until we have those things, we shouldn't start thinking about tax cuts. And so to answer your question, the first place I would look would be to roll back that tax bill that we passed, that the legislature passed. I didn't support in the last session.
Daniel wants to know, if you win the primaries, what will be your strategy to win the general election?
Well, I think it really comes down to talking to people about, what matters to them. Frankly, I think that the party and the candidate that figures out how best to address this issue of economic insecurity that families are feeling, to get peace of mind back to middle class and lower income and small businesses, is going to win the general election, and the person that takes on this very significant issue of the racial disparities in our state. That is how we're going to win the 2010 election. I think, one of the things I learned from 2016, and I think a lot of us learned, is that kind of not standing up for your values, not being bold about your vision for the state of Minnesota, not being willing to articulate how we're going to help the people that are most disadvantaged in this state, while also helping everybody else and lifting all boats. If we don't kind of attack those issues and talk about those issues and talk about the issues that really mean something to people on the ground, we're not going to win. I met a woman a couple months ago up in Mora, Minnesota, and she came up to me with tears in her eyes, talking about, she had 2 kids in the high school there, and because of cuts to education at the high school, they had raised the fees for after-school activities. And she was put into a position of having to choose between which of her kids, she could only afford to have one of her kids participate in an after-school activity. And, that is what the issue for her about what this election needs to be about. And we can talk all we want about school funding and the mechanisms for what we do about that, but it really has to be about responding to that woman's deep concern, the unfair choice that she's being put in as a parent who wants to do great by all of her kids. And if we can kind of bring our politics back down to that kind of human scale, where we're taking these 30,000 foot approaches and really understanding the issues, but really connecting it to the things that matter to people, I think we're going to win. And the other thing that I think is really important about this, I have to say the last several years have kind of radicalized me in a way that I wouldn't have expected. Just listening to a lot of the stories as I go around the state, understanding kind of how the challenges that people are facing in this state. And at the end of the day, the other thing I think we have to do to win this election, and it connects issues around the environment and education funding and healthcare, all of these issues we've been talking about and probably we'll talk about more tonight. It's the fact that so much power, economic and political power, is being concentrated in too few hands these days. I just had a press conference today on net neutrality to make Minnesota a place where we're going to make sure that ISPs, internet service providers, actually abide by common sense principles of net neutrality. Again, this is an issue of the people that have power and wanting to consolidate more and more power in their own hands. And if as Democrats or as progressives we're not talking about that issue, it plays out in campaign finance reform as well. But if we're not talking about that issue, we're not going to solve all the issues that we need to solve in this state and help ordinary Minnesotans get ahead, because until we solve that issue, we're going to be fighting a serious, serious uphill battle.
Lucy Marie wants to know, what would you do to make higher education affordable to all, not just those who come from well-to-do families?
Well, another one of the big issues that I hear about across the state, and another one of these fundamental economic security issues that we have to tackle. The thing that I've said is I think we need to get to debt-free college and come from the principle that higher education in whatever form, whether it's a 4-year college, a 2-year college, technical education, whatever it is not just a private good, which is I think how Republicans or conservatives want to frame it up, that you need to get a college and pay for it because it's going to benefit you. The fact of the matter is higher education is a public good, because the more skills people get, the better off all of the economy is going to be, and the better off we're all going to be. And if we take that kind of value statement and apply it to higher education, coming up with a plan that is about making sure that people can graduate without incurring debt, I think is important. That doesn't mean that people not necessarily are going to have to work a summer job to earn some of their tuition. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. But I do think graduating with huge amounts of debt is a serious problem. So that takes a public investment. When I was speaker and we froze college tuition, we put $250 million into our higher education system so that we could freeze tuition while at the same time not having the services, the classes, the access to professors limited. We want to have a robust higher education system and keep tuition down. That's the goal. So putting more public resources into it is an important part of it. But we also need to kind of deal with the folks that have already incurred the debt today. And one of the things I think we can do, we can expand our refinancing program so you don't have to pay 10% or 8% on your loans, but can pay 3% on your loans. Minnesota's starting to do with that, but it's not reaching enough people. We can do that, and that could have a big impact. But more important than that, I think we really need to think about college debt the same way the Affordable Care Act, in a sense, thought about healthcare, which was we should put a percentage that no one has to pay more of their income to pay off their college debt, and put a time limitation around it, say 10 years. And so if you get a job that is making $30,000, you're going to have to pay kind of a lower amount to repay your debt than someone that's getting a job that's making $150,000. And in that way, I think we are building toward this notion that we're helping out the folks that have incurred this huge debt already, but we're building on this notion that it's not just about a private good, but it really is a public good for all of us. So those are, I think, some of the things we need to think about as we think about this higher education issue. And it's going to take, again, a significant investment, but we do have a tremendous amount of wealth in this state, in this country. And if there's one place, one of the places that could make the biggest impact with investing that wealth, it would be in making sure that more and more Minnesotans get the kind of higher skills beyond high school that we need to have a prosperous economy, but more importantly, that they and their families can prosper as well.
Jordan asks, what policies of Mark Dayton will you continue, and what do you want to change? Another great question. Thank you, Jordan. So, I guess I worked very closely with the governor as 6 years as leader of the Democrats in the State House, and I really respect a lot of the work that he's done, and I think he's on the right track with a lot of stuff. If there's a couple things that I would point out, I think the work that he's done on clean water has been, and raising that up as an issue that's really important, because it is going to be a huge economic advantage, quality of life advantage, all of those things to us. And if we don't do something, things are going to go very much the wrong way. I think he's done a great job on that. I think he's also done the start of some important work around racial equity that I would like to continue, but we need to do a lot more on that front. The thing that I guess I would change is not necessarily even a policy,
But what I would like to see and what I want to do as the next governor, and I think is really important, particularly if we're facing a more conservative or right-wing legislature, is to get out of St. Paul, to get out of the Capitol, to get out of the governor's mansion more, and get out among the people and really kind of raise the energy. Because I really believe, and my experience tells me, with when we pass marriage equality or pass the minimum wage or the Women's Economic Security Act or any number of things that we passed, the only way that those things happened was not because people in the Capitol sat down and thought, oh, this is a great idea, and they just passed the bill. The only reason those things happen is because people outside the Capitol, all across the state of Minnesota, said, we need to do something about that. And they had the energy and the organization to bring the pressure to bear on the leaders at the Capitol to make that happen. I still remember the most profound moment of my time as Speaker was when we passed marriage equality. And I choked up when I gavelled in the vote, when it passed, for a number of reasons, partly because I was looking at some of the members that took a vote that they knew could cost them their legislative career, and yet they did the right thing. And we lack that kind of political courage too much in this state, in this country these days, and we need to restore more of that. But as important, I was thinking of all the people, and there were thousands of people at the Capitol that day, just outside the chamber door, whose lives really were going to be fundamentally changed as a result. But more importantly, who actually made this happen. And to think about their faces and the commitment that they made to make it happen, that's what our politics is all about. That's what great progressive politics is all about. And I think we need a governor that's going to do the smart policy work in the Capitol, and I think I have a strong record of actually getting stuff done for everyday Minnesotans, but someone who's also going to go out among the people of Minnesota and kind of organize them and engage them and talk to them about what issues are important and listen to them about what they think is important, so we can raise that kind of energy again to make real progressive change in the state. So I agree with many of the things that the governor did and support a lot of the decisions and direction that he headed this state. But I also think we need a governor that's going to be more energetic in getting out and engaging the people of Minnesota.
Mary asks, could you tell us about some instances you worked across the aisle in the legislature, especially as minority leader, to reach a positive outcome?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first one that I can think of actually was before I became leader in the legislature. And it was working, one of my passions is children's health care. And I carried a bill in 2007 called the Children's Health Security Act. And at the time, Governor Pawlenty was the governor, a Republican. And what this bill was really about was breaking down the barriers that get in the way of kids getting access to see a doctor or nurse. And we worked very closely with Governor Pawlenty and the Republicans in the legislature who were his allies to get that bill passed. And as a result, tens of thousands of more Minnesotan kids got access to health care. So that is one example. Just this last legislative session, I mean, I carried a couple of bills, one of which, and it was kind of astounding to me that I found out that this was the case, but Minnesota schools don't have any requirement, or didn't until this last legislative session, to test their water in their drinking fountains for lead. Lead is a terrible toxic substance that has a huge impact on brain development for kids. And so this year I worked with my Republican colleagues, carried the bill, and we put into place a law that said every school district actually has to test for lead, and if they find heightened levels of lead, they have to remediate it, they have to fix it. So those are a couple of examples. But many of the things that I've done in the legislature have been, I've spent more than half my time in the minority, and every session have gotten some significant pieces of legislation done, because I really do believe that the only test of politics, of success in politics, is getting stuff done. The other thing I will say, though, in response to this is we have to work across the aisle, and we have to work very hard to get stuff done for Minnesotans. But it's also important we stand up for our values. And one of the other things that I think I demonstrated and would do as the next governor is also be clear about what my values are and draw a line when I think what the Republicans are trying to do is going to go beyond that line. So you need to have that combination of willing to work with other folks and the willingness to actually have a backbone and stand up when things are not satisfactory or they're going to undermine my view of what is going to make us a successful state. And I think that one example on that front, in my 6 years as the leader of the Democrats in the state house, the Republicans did not pass a single tax bill. We stopped them from passing a tax bill, and in that case it would have been tax cuts for very well-connected people in every single instance. We stopped that because I knew what the impact was going to be. It was going to hurt everyday Minnesotans. It was going to send us back into a budget deficit, which means that budget deficit is going to be balanced on the back of working and middle-class Minnesotans. This last session, after I stepped down as leader, the Republicans did pass this big tax bill. And we are in deficit again. It means that we're going to have to, be facing calls for cuts to things that matter to everyday Minnesotans, like cuts to our schools and cuts to health care. That is the wrong direction for us to go. So we have to work together when we can, but it's when it's going to endanger the future of the state of Minnesota, you have to be willing to stand up and say that's not going to be okay.
Aaron asks, do you support a single-payer healthcare system, and how would you fight to make it happen?
So yes, I do, and the way I think you fight to make it happen is to do what I said a little bit earlier, which is to go out among the people of Minnesota and explain that this is what a single payer or a Medicare for all system means for you, and really come back to basic values. We don't want our neighbors. I don't want my neighbor to be in a situation where he can't afford to go see a doctor or nurse when he wants to. A single payer can help solve this. And I want to have a system where I know that if I'm sick, someone's going to take care of me, and I'm willing to take care of them if they're sick. I mean, that's the basic value proposition once again. And if we can go out to the people in Minnesota and talk about it from that perspective, but also talk about it from the perspective that is not just about who's paying, but we have to make healthcare delivery better. We have to keep people well more effectively. We have to invest in public health and in research and development. If we can talk about it from all of those perspectives, I think Minnesota actually can really lead the way in making that happen. And there's steps that we can take along the way. The Minnesota Care buy-in, so having a true public option in this state, I think, is one step in the direction of that. Maybe if it's a question of the dollars, starting with making sure that all kids have coverage, and everybody from 50 to 65, who are the folks that really are facing the challenges of unaffordability, fall into a Medicare for all or an extension of Medicare, and then start to close that gap. We can think about, are there particular areas like mental health where we really struggle, that we can say, okay, for mental health issues, we're going to all be in the same risk pool. So I think that there's steps that we can take and be very creative about, but at the end of the day, more and more Minnesotans that I talk to, small businesses who don't want the burden of having to figure out how to pay for health care for their employees, big corporations who, again, can't compete internationally as well because they're carrying this heavy burden of having to pay for health care for their employees, as well as, everyday Minnesotans who are struggling as, individual farmers or individual small business people to actually find affordable health care. There is a point, we are at a tipping point in this state, in this country, where I think something like a single payer system is becoming so common sense, such an obvious solution that we can get there.
Carrie asks, current rates of recidivism are too high. Having a little trouble reading part of it.
Yes.
How do we address that in order to keep people from returning to prison once they are out?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is we should probably be putting fewer people in prison because prison itself leads to recidivism. And so changing, as an example, one of the things I support is legalizing marijuana. And the main reason I support that is the terrible racial disparities in the sentencing that goes along with that. And that's just the start of it, of course. But that's, one example. So we can start with a criminal justice system that is actually about justice and not leading people in there. And one of the most profound lessons I ever learned, I'm a lawyer in my other job and have done worked as a public defender, but I represented a guy in Texas on a pro bono basis who was on death row there for 10 years, and we kind of fought in the court system for 10 years and finally freed him. He was wrongly sentenced, and he's now out. He's a minister, actually, and doing some really great work down in Texas. But the thing that I learned most from that is that the person that commits a crime, when a crime is committed, is not necessarily the same person 5 years later, right? We all change, we all grow. I think mercy has to be as much a part of our justice system as retribution, and that experience working with Martin for those 10 years really taught me that in a very profound way. So I think if we start from that perspective, we put fewer people in jail so they don't kind of have to live through that circumstance and to get separated from their families, etc. We focus on treatment and education in our prison system, and I've visited every prison in the state of Minnesota over the course of my legal career and my legislative career. And there's some really good stuff going on, but too often that piece of it, the education, the therapy doesn't get taken care of. And the other thing I think we have to acknowledge is that our prison system is filled with people who suffer from mental health and from chemical addiction problems. And if we're not dealing with the treatment side of that, I think that we're really falling behind. So I guess it's all of those things. And then once people are out, we banned the box when I was Speaker of the House. So you don't have to file on your job application, at least on the initial application, that you were convicted of have a criminal record, just to get you in the door so you can make the case face-to-face with the person making the hiring decision. We should do that with housing, with credit, with all of those things, so people can get in the door. We should restore felon voting rights when people get out of jail instead of waiting until they serve out their time on probation. We should put a time limit on probation. Minnesota has pretty low rates of imprisonment, although it's growing drastically, but we keep people on paper much longer than most other states. If we time limited that to 5 years, I think we could actually get people back into kind of the community much more effectively. So that piece of it is really important as well.
Jen asks, how do you see resource mining and transportation changing in Minnesota over the next 5 years? What are your priorities for the state in that field, or in those fields?
Right.
Yeah.
So on transportation, again, the first thing is we do need to make a very significant investment in our transportation infrastructure, and that's not going to change drastically by technology over the next 5 years. But I do think we need to start thinking ahead, both in terms of how we fund our transportation system, and this is a discussion we do need to have around the gas tax, and around how we create, safety and laws. Electric vehicles, as an example, are going to become a more significant part, even probably in the next 5 years, of our transportation infrastructure. Transit and different types of transit options are going to become a more important part of our transportation infrastructure in the next 5 and 10 years. So thinking ahead about how we start to not just pay for a transportation system in that type of world, and we ought to drive up fuel efficiency standards even further in the state of Minnesota, just like California has done. That's going to change some of that. So we need to think about that piece of it, not just from a funding perspective, though, but from an infrastructure perspective. I mean, one of the things that is really holding back, electric vehicles and battery is the life of the battery, which is going to change, but also where the infrastructure is so you can recharge those things. And the state of Minnesota ought to be thinking much more clearly about that. In terms of resource mining, I do think that, again, we're going to be making a transition, in the future, I don't know if we're going to be making a transition in the next 5 years away from resource mining, frankly. I mean, I think our iron mining continues to be an important piece of the economy in northeastern Minnesota, and I don't know that that's going to change. I think technology and automation is changing in terms of the number of jobs that are supported, and we need to think about that, and that has to do with, investment in broadband and investment in increasing the value we can draw, not just from mining the resource, but actually processing the resource much more effectively in the state of Minnesota, and we need to think very hard about that. In terms of new types of mining, we have some serious decisions coming up in the next 2 or 3 years. And to me, the two principles that I'm going to fall back on is we are a state, and I believe in the rule of law, and we should not short circuit any process leading up to those decisions. And I also believe that in science, and I believe that we're the party of science, and we should follow the science as we go through this decision-making process. So I don't know if I totally answered your question. I don't know in terms of priorities for the state in that field, but making sure that, I guess a couple things in terms of priorities. Making sure that we're keeping our waters as safe as possible and our environment as safe as possible. That doesn't mean risk-free, but that has to be a top priority. Making sure that the wealth that is extracted from our resource mining stays here in Minnesota as far as possible instead of leaking out across state borders or across country borders is really, really important. And making sure we're doing as much as possible to not just extract those resources, but to process them here so that we are continuing to, again, gain as much wealth as possible if we do go down that path.
All right, this is our last question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Ellie S., as someone watching this while holding her 2-month-old baby, can we do something about the caucus to get more people involved? And she says, thanks for doing the Facebook Live so she can stay informed while in her pajamas, which I'm sure you're not the only one, Ellie. So.
All right. So, well, first of all, congratulations on your baby. That's really exciting. And thank you for staying engaged and involved. It's a really, really good question. So I think that there are things we can do, first of all, with technology to engage more people in the process. I like the caucus process because it is kind of grassroots, and it's allows people that don't have a lot of money to participate in our politics, which a primary system does not. But a couple of things. The first is we need to be much more open as a party to making sure that new voices are heard. And a lot of times, and I hear this from a lot of particularly young people, that they feel like their voices aren't being heard and that we're not engaging them, and we're not respecting them. We're not respecting their new ideas and the new things that they can bring. People are too set in their ways. We need to blow that open. We need to engage technology more effectively. And there may be ways that we can use things like social media for people to get engaged. But the most important thing to me is we are going to get more people engaged in the caucus process, not just by kind of cleaning up the process, but by actually talking about things that matter to people through the caucus process. And I come back to that again and again, speaking to like the real issues that people are facing, that you're facing as a mom of a 2-month-old, and the challenge you face, as you're thinking about, I don't know what the issues for you are, but as you're thinking about childcare, as you're thinking about, how can I go back to work, if you're going to go back to work, and have a place that's fair and can accommodate me as a new mother in a way that is different than was before. That can think about, is my child going to have the kind of public school options that I want so that they can really succeed in life and blossom? Schools that can reach and teach and inspire every child. Those are the kind of things, if we speak about those things, we can break through a lot of kind of the obstacles that the process puts up, because people are going to feel like this caucus actually matters to them and is going to lead to a result that matters in their lives. So again, I think it's as much about reforming our politics as it is about reforming the process. But I really appreciate the time that you've given me tonight, and thanks for the great questions. A lot of questions that I actually, frankly, have never heard before. So that was really, really good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, for joining Stand Up Minnesota for this town hall, and thank you on the live stream for all of your excellent questions. The recording of this town hall will be available shortly for viewing in the group, so you can watch it at your leisure. Our next town hall will be Thursday, January 4th with Rebecca Otto. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.